Welcome to The Big Interview. I'm Alan Murray. I'm here with Clay Shirky, who's an associate professor at New York University. Yep. But for purposes of this discussion, you're also the author of this article, Foreign Affairs, the Political Power of Social Media. Now, this is the January-February edition. I happen to know this was on the streets long before anything happened in Tunisia, anything happened in Egypt, anything happened in Bahrain, Iran. What did you know that we didn't know?
Well, I knew really only two big things, which is one, political struggle as a result of coordinated action, right? Governments aren't afraid of informed individuals. They're afraid of synchronized groups. And two, I knew that the tools I study, the internet, mobile phones, the relation among people using those tools, allows for larger coordination at lower cost across a wider area. And when you put those two facts together, you say the presence of coordinating tools in the hands of people with a political grievance changes the dynamic of a group.
And how much does it change the dynamic? I mean, obviously, this is coordinated action. You had Martin Luther and his 95 Theses. You had Thomas Paine and his pamphlets. I mean, is the technology really that big of a difference?
So I would say the technology is that big of a difference if it's a big difference, which is to say the reason Martin Luther's use of the printing press was a big deal was partly because of the characteristics of the printing press, but partly because the printing press was so new, no one really knew how to react. So the tension between rulers and the governed is always an arms race. Right, so the printing press made a big difference to Luther. It made a big difference in, obviously in the American condition, as you say, with Tom Paine and Ben Franklin, made a big difference to the French Revolution. But the governments of the world got good at managing in a world with printing presses. Then television came along, radio, Voice of America kind of stuff. And so there's always this arms race characteristic about these things. So the time when a technology makes the biggest difference is the time when it's the most different from what's around it, which is now when we're thinking about the internet. And
although you mentioned Voice of America, we obviously had great hopes at one time that media would bring down the Iron Curtain, would make the Berlin Wall crumble. It wasn't really media at the end of the day that did it.
And it wasn't really media at the end of the day that it did it in Egypt. What the difference is does the media allow a group of people to coordinate, to synchronize their beliefs and coordinate their actions? Voice of America didn't do that as well as we liked, but we did a bunch of other stuff like smuggling Xerox machines into Poland during the Solidarity uprisings. That was much more about creating the press, sort of a small print press that the workers could read, than it was about broadcasting a signal to the whole country.
But so you're saying it's less about media in the sense of kind of broadcasting ideas to a large group of people, and more about communication, about making it possible for groups to coordinate their activities among each other.
Yes, and one of the interesting open questions here, and by here I mean the events in we can now call them revolutions, the revolution in Tunisia and Egypt, the uprisings in Algeria, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, is to what degree did the twin effects of the presence of Al Jazeera plus social tools for synchronizing beliefs and coordinating actions matter? Because it's pretty clear that Al Jazeera has also been a big change in the region, certainly the first critical press that we've seen in that part of the world in living memory. But it's also clear that Al Jazeera wasn't the thing that allowed the protesters to coordinate their actions. So one of the big open research questions is, how much did Al Jazeera help everybody understand what was going on? And then how much did mobile phones and social media help people coordinate the reaction? It seems to have been a 1-2 punch.
Well, and it raises an interesting question. I mean, we, because of our culture and our background, we believe that a free press is a basic civil right. We believe that.
That's right.
But what about free communication, free, fast communication among people? You and I were in Davos the day that Vittorio Caleo, the CEO of Vodafone, stood up and told the crowd that the Egyptian authorities had come to him and said, shut down the network. And he checked his legal authority and said, we did it. We had to do it. Did he do the right thing? Should it be the basic right of the Egyptian people to have that kind of fast communication that texting and social networks give you?
Well, so the question of rights, as much as people have argued since the rights of man that there are universal rights, there really aren't. There are bargained for rights that different groups of people regard as sacred. So because of our First Amendment, we regard those media rights as sacred. I think, speaking from a U.S. perspective, we would very much like to live in a world in which the right to essentially freedom of assembly, the freedom of assembly along with freedom of the press, part of the First Amendment, becomes spread worldwide.
But there's another piece here. There's the technology piece. I mean,
Yeah.
I was
Oh,
in
yeah.
that
But as there was with freedom of the press.
Yeah, I was in that session with Vittorio Caleo when this came up, and right before then, someone had said, "Are we reaching the point where it should be considered a basic right to have access to a cell phone?"
Right. Well, so all I mean to say is we have to ask who's doing the considering. Certainly in the United States, there's only two technologies mentioned in the Bill of Rights, presses and guns.
Yeah.
And in both cases, we essentially secured citizen access to them. We would like a world in which freedom of assembly, as supported by these networks, is a basic human right. So the question for Vodafone is, what they did legal? Yes, I'm not a lawyer, but yes, I'm sure it was. But it was still wrong.
Did they have a choice?
They had the same choice state media did. I doubt they had a choice about shutting it down, which is to say they could have been shut down upstream.
Right.
Where I think they erred was involuntarily sending the pro-Mubarak messages as a blanket SMS. Because by that point there were ample examples of the ability of state media workers to walk away from their jobs in protest. And I think the fact that Vodafone did a legal but evil thing may satisfy their lawyers, but ought not satisfy their customers. I don't think we can rely on the language of human rights to secure revolutionary change of the sort we've seen in Tunisia and Egypt. There, I think what we have to rely on is economic factors. Because a nation, as we saw with Egypt, a nation that disconnects from the internet, disconnects its mobile phones, is a nation that essentially opts out of the economy. And so this dilemma of, if you want to plug in, you simply have to put the tools that allow for a certain amount of freedom in the hands of the citizens.
And if you don't do that, you become Albania circa
Burma.
1970. Burma.
I mean, Burma's my example.
Okay, but
and,
here's
yeah.
the
Albania,
alternative.
circa anything, yes.
There's Burma, but there's also China.
Right.
All right. Now
Right.
here's a country that seems to have done a pretty good job figuring out where the economic benefits are
Right.
and making the
And
most of the
separating
economic
them.
benefits,
Right.
but
Right.
separating
Right.
the fundamental freedom of speech and communication.
Yep.
Why can they do that, and why wouldn't every other country say, well, that's the model we need to follow? Every other
Of course, every other
Oppressive
autocratic country, and
yes.
it's kind of the Singapore model as well. The Philip Howard, who has written an amazing book called The Digital Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, looked at the effects of increased internet and mobile phone penetration in Muslim states and said it correlates, better communications tools correlate with democratizing events with one exception. When it's an oil-rich nation, they can essentially buy their way out of the political pressures. So what China has done is, in the absence of oil, it's gotten economic hypergrowth of the sort that keeps people relatively tolerant of other kinds of government intervention.
they're getting the economic benefits, so they're willing to
They're
tolerate
almost getting
the
the
other
economic,
stuff.
the kind of economic benefits that Saudi Arabia gets, except that they're having to get it from their own people. So they have to give more freedom to the people, but as long as they have, double-digit growth rates. So there are basically two camps in the China and communications strategy camp. There is they are postponing the political pressures versus they will never suffer from the political pressures. So Evgeny Morozov, Rebecca McKinnon are in the kind of they'll never suffer the political pressures. They've cracked the formula. I think it's not happening now, in part because of the economic hypergrowth, but I'm one of the few people I know who is short the CCP's control of China. In fact, I just recently made a bet with another social scientist that in 10 years' time, the CCP will not be in control of China.
But people have been saying that for 20, 30
no,
years.
and I could lose. I could easily lose. And in fact, if I'd made the bet 10 years ago, I would have
You
lost.
would have lost, yeah.
But I'm net short the CCP right now because what I'm seeing is anti-corruption protests at the local level. Ordinary Han Chinese, not members of the Falun Gong, not Uyghurs, not Tibetans, just the Han Chinese population protesting, being turfed out of their land for development projects, in some cases hanging or self-immolating themselves in response. We've seen this before. The Sichuanese anti-corruption protests after the school buildings collapsed during the earthquake. And that I don't think that the central government will be able to keep a lid on the demand for less corrupt local government for 10 years.
This is a very important point, because what you're saying is it's not disaffected minorities ultimately that do the trick.
That is right.
It's the disaffected majority. That's what we saw in Egypt, and that's what you're saying is starting to come up in China.
Right. And there is, it is like all very simple models. It compresses a lot of details, but the sort of classic model of this kind of insurgent-based political change is small protest, large protest, military betrayal. And both Tunisia and Egypt had exactly that pattern, which is a small group of people exhibit their anger in such a way that the state either doesn't or can't keep them down. Enough other people feel the same way and see that the group is relatively safe, that there's safety in numbers, and the protest swells. And then at some point the military refuses to open fire on their own people.
But that gets to another issue, and perhaps another paradigm. Is there a point at which, if the regime is ruthless enough, they will last it out? I mean, Tiananmen
yes.
was a pretty incredible event.
Exactly,
Tiananmen Square,
exactly.
Iran in June of 2009.
So the thing about Iran in June of 2009 is they actually failed to keep the crowds down. It was Iran in December of 2009 through February of 2010. In fact, the Egyptian government fell on the one-year anniversary of the final failed crackdown of the first phase of the Green Wave. We'll see now whether this phase of the Green Wave succeeds or not. But so I think the larger answer to your question is basically yes, right? When the Thai government was willing to open fire on Thai Rak Thai, when the Iranians were willing to crack down on the Green Wave, when the Chinese were willing to open fire on Tiananmen, those were the kind of events that put the insurgency down. Interestingly, in the case of Tiananmen, the local militias refused to fire on the students, and the Chinese had to bring in people who didn't have local sensibilities. Whereas in Cairo, what you had is Cairenes potentially being ordered to fire on other Cairenes and refusing. So in a way,
and then they brought in the thugs. They emptied
Right, exactly,
out the prisons.
exactly right.
And said maybe these folks will do it.
Right. Maybe these folks are not so committed to. I mean, basically, you need the idea that commitment to the state is commitment to the ruling party rather than commitment to the people. And in both cases, interesting, the Egyptian army and the Tunisian army said, we are here to guard the people. So in a way, you need a military that is much more like a Praetorian Guard than it is like a national defense unit. We don't know whether or not that degree of military crackdown can keep an autocratic power.
We may find out in the next few months at the rate things are going.
We may find out, but the interesting thing is we do have a pretty good idea that you can't do that and also be an industrialized economy. Which is to say, the Chinese seem to have said after Tiananmen, we can get away with that trick exactly one time.
We can't do it again.
And we can't do it again. And in fact, much of the neoliberal model of the Chinese state we've seen since then is, I think, an attempt to find other ways to maintain power while keeping the populace happy rather than using the military threat. Because I think if it comes to Tiananmen 2,
Right. You, in the piece you wrote for Foreign Affairs, which again was before Tunisia, before Egypt, congratulations.
I complained to the editor about how long, in fact, it was taking to get onto the stands, but the timing turned out to be
So you
quite
actually
good.
wrote it last year sometime.
Oh yeah, I wrote it. I wrote it last September and October, turned it in. It was the final draft was in by the beginning of November.
Well, it was an excellent and prescient piece. But you asked the question in that piece, how does the ubiquity of social media affect U.S. interests? And that's still a good question.
Yes.
I mean, we don't know if events in Egypt will turn out to be in U.S. interest, right?
We don't, although I think we know what the question is now, which is to the degree that it is democratic. The short-term question of U.S. interest has almost always been about access to oil, keeping down a sort of purely Islamist government.
It's stability.
It's
stability. It's a basic kind of small c conservatism, right?
It's a basic kind of small c conservatism.
I mean, it seems to me the question about social media is, Do they enhance democracy? Well, yes, maybe they seem to. They enhance communication. Then do they enhance stability? Well, no, they seem not to. And are those two things in conflict at some point?
I think the question is sort of second order, which is, does democracy enhance stability? We don't have any examples of industrialized countries that are industrialized autocracies that lasted longer than 70 years. Right? We've had industrialization for some centuries now. There are no industrialized countries that have lasted longer than 70 years. The Chinese are coming up on that anniversary. One of the reasons, in fact, I was willing to enter into this bet is I thought this will be an interesting test case. But the question of stability around, say, a royal family with not even a pretense of democracy that has unlimited oil money or thereabouts, e.g. Saudi Arabia, is a very different kind of question than what happens in Libya or what happens in Algeria.
Yeah, but I guess the question I'm asking is, even if these have democratizing tendencies, as you pointed out at the beginning of this interview, what they really are doing, they're not changing the social dynamic, they're speeding up the social dynamic. They're making it faster, easier.
Right, yes.
And is it possible that faster and easier could be, in the long run, less stable and long-lasting? That it creates the likelihood that you can't have a smooth transition to democracy, and it creates the opportunity for a Muslim Brotherhood or someone to...
I mean, that's an interesting question. So the Muslim Brotherhood question, as a side question, there's a very interesting paper just come out showing that statistically there's good reason to think that Islamist parties in the region intentionally lose elections so that they can still be outsiders, because if they actually take power, they're going to have to take out the garbage. And they'll start to be judged not on fealty to Sharia, but on how well they take out the garbage.
And then if the people don't like the way they're taking out the garbage, they may back away from democracy.
The Islamist government may back away from democracy. That's always a question. But what I'd say about, so color me naive, I suppose, but I think that democracy itself is better for stability, in part because democracy institutionalizes insurgency, right? We have an uprising in this country every 4 years in which we get a chance to replace our supreme leader.
Yeah, but the issue is not whether democracy enhances stability, it's the transition to democracy.
Right, no, whether or not it makes it harder. It is certainly the case, and this is actually a really interesting case, it is certainly the case that because these tools allow relatively large groups to coordinate their discontent with the government, you get protest movements that can, as we see, overwhelm even states that are dramatically well provisioned for putting down dissent. What we don't see in those situations, we don't see leaders emerge in advance, right? You couldn't have said who's the leader of the Jasmine Revolution in Tunisia, because it was
they couldn't.
Right.
Well, so, I mean, to me, it's sort of parallel to the argument that we've been going through the last few years about free markets. I mean, what we have discovered is, to the extent that you enhance free market activity, you allow it, technology allows it to happen faster and more quickly. We all thought, well, the freer the market, the more stable it would be, and we learned something else.
Right, exactly. All of a sudden, there's 1,000 points down in one
The
afternoon.
oscillations are much wilder. So, could we be seeing something similar?
So we could be seeing something similar. I think the thing to look at would be this: if the ability to coordinate large amounts of social dissent without needing a hierarchical leadership that controls the counter movement, if that actually creates a power vacuum in which other autocratic forces can step in, then yes, what we've got is a better way to take down autocracies, but not a better way to replace them. Anne Applebaum has made a similar argument in the Washington Post. When I saw the Tunisian leaders of the new Tunisian government, they're always careful to say new Tunisian government, speak, what was really interesting to me is that all of them, this is head of the central bank, minister of sport, minister of communications, and so forth, minister of communications technology and so forth. And they all said essentially, we get that we have 6 months to build a government that can withstand a democratic election, because they understood that the constituency that had put them in power, inchoate as it was as a formal political force, could nevertheless take them out of power again. And the military in Egypt, a much more complicated situation, seems to have some of the same realization. But what's so interesting?
So you're optimistic.
I'm I'm hopeful. I think optimistic suggests I'd be willing to make a prediction on it. I'm I'm optimistic in the Tunisian case because I've seen the ministers. I'm hopeful for Egypt. The risk, of course, is the military simply decides that democracy is too inimical to its interests. But El Baradei's inability to put himself in as the leader, oh, my people have called and I've returned home, that did not last. Suggests that either we start to see homegrown leaders like Wael Ghanem, the Google engineer who left his job to go back into the country for the Jan 25 protests, or that we see some kind of hybrid of the relatively technocratic elements of the Egyptian government elevated to, or Egyptian society elevated to leadership roles.
You're doing pretty good here on predictions, right?
Yeah.
So
we'll see about the Chinese.
And we've got the Chinese prediction on record. We'll have you back in 10 years to see
that's
how
great.
that one
See
worked
whether
out.
I lost $100 on it.
But let's do a little short-term predicting here. I mean, you've got Bahrain, you've got Iran, you've got Algeria. No one knows exactly what's going on in Libya. You've got a whole host of this, Yemen, going on in the Middle East. How far do you think this is going?
Well, I mean, it's quite clearly going regional, and one of the interesting things about these events is that the likelihood of a revolution in all countries 2 through N is higher when one has been successful in the first country, because both because I think of a degree of if they can have democracy in Egypt, then all of this argument about this region must be autocratic goes away, both for the people on the street and, frankly, for the world's governments. The U.S. is simply less willing to support autocracy in the region now than it was 2 weeks ago, not necessarily out of any changed moral conviction, but simply out of a sense that we're going to have to do business with whoever's in power 6 weeks from now, so we ought to be a little more.
There's probably some sharing of tactics going on.
But this is the other thing, and this is I think the amazing thing. Again, back to Philip Howard, who called the effect modularity. If Gillian York surfaced this beautiful example of Tunisians and Egyptians on a soccer bulletin board, just talking about soccer in North Africa, the various teams and so forth. And the Tunisians started giving the Egyptians tips on this is how you survive an onion gas attack. If you're approaching a police checkpoint.
On a soccer board.
On a soccer board. Because ultimately, and this is I think a key thing to understand about these tools, people look at them and say, oh, this is all just teenagers wasting their time, which is true to the 99th percentile. But 99% is not 100%. And when things turn political, any place people gather takes on a political.
It's the water cooler times 100.
Exactly. So Gaddafi, in addition to freaking out about social media, as I think he ought, has also banned soccer, because soccer stadiums are also places
where people gather.
So he's basically making social life illegal because it's now so politicized and so threatening. So in terms of how far this goes, I mean, if I had to pick a country that I was willing to predict would suffer some kind of significant reversal or change of government because of popular uprising, I'd pick Libya, sandwiched as it is between Tunisia and Egypt, and integrated as it is into that culture. Bahrain, obviously royal system, so it's less conflicted about the use of force. On the other hand, Shiite majority, Sunni minority, which we know to be a volatile combination.
Iran?
My God, Iran is such a hard situation because the green wave did not go away, but it did go underground, which is to say the insurgent movement has been waiting to happen, exactly as happened in Egypt after the April 6th, the 2008 uprising. That was crushed but didn't go away. It just went and was waiting. Yeah. So I would suggest, I think the green wave is going to be dramatically more forceful this time. On the other hand, the last time, 2009, essentially pushed Iran over into being really a military dictatorship with a thin veneer of theocracy on top. If I had to pick, alas, a country that I think might suffer the Romanian events, which is to say all of the countries of Eastern Europe had relatively velvet revolutions, and then it was in Romania where the bloodshed happened. If there was a country where the rulers finally convinced part of the armed forces to simply open fire in large numbers, my fear is that it would be
the
Tehran.
place. Clay Shirky, fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thanks
for
good to see you.
Great.